We have a very impressive panel here today, and the topic is outstanding. I'll start off quoting Charles Dickens in A Tale of Two Cities. He pens, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness." From my point of view, that's what we're seeing in this whole television 2.0 world, which by definition combines broadband TV, mobile TV, and eventually IPTV as well. About a year ago when I did this panel, we talked about what's going to happen, and the forecast was that what internet did for commerce, broadband will do for content, and we see that happening left and right. There are articles in Wall Street Journal, New York Times, all over the place, all large media companies trying to figure out what kind of television 2.0 offerings can they launch. However, they're still struggling with the business models. I think to balance out the revenue opportunity and the user experience in this completely new paradigm is becoming a challenge for them. And to address those challenges and questions about television 2.0, we've gathered an outstanding group of people here. I'll start off with having them introduce themselves. So Phil, starting with you, if you can talk about your current, I guess in your case, your previous role. You can't talk much about your current role, but your experience, your role, and the kinds of things that you have been involved in that are relevant to this.
Sure. My previous role that we were referring to was as the CTO of Sony Corp of America, and in that role, I worked with the music company, the pictures company, PlayStation, as well as electronics, building new digital businesses. Prior to that, I built the digital businesses at Sony Music, and given that I'm at a new startup that I just founded a couple of months ago, I can't really talk about it too much. I'm going to act as the sage from the music industry today. Because in my previous life, I started a company that was the first online music distribution company. It's called Liquid Audio. And we built all the foundational technology, digital rights management, before it was called digital rights management, and the distribution technologies around that. And as I walk through this hall, it reminds me of a Jupiter conference from 1997, where there was a lot of wonderful joy around new complexities of business models and so forth. And the reality was we had to really dumb it down. And Steve Jobs came in 7 years later and dumbed it down for us and revolutionized the industry on the back of the potential, but by really paying attention to the consumer. In my current role as the president of Building B, we are a new home entertainment company that is a direct-to-the-consumer service. And what we are doing is rebuilding the entire infrastructure in terms of delivery, the experience in the home, building that on the back of a new combination of wireless technologies to create a new user experience. And one experience that's really optimized around what consumers are actually doing and what they want to do in a very simple manner in the living room. And as I sat on panels earlier today, I was pleased to hear a lot of discussion around interoperability and competing systems and infrastructure that doesn't work together, because that's a great opportunity for a new company to come into a market, take all the innovations around content, distribution to the home, and new innovations in terms of presentation to the user, and create a breakthrough experience while everyone else is trying to figure out how to get their pieces to work together.
Phil, can I ask you a personal question?
Uh-oh.
What does B stand for in Building B?
It stands for the barn we work in right now. Which is great, you know.
So it's not building blocks?
No, it's not building blocks.
Good to know. Tony?
My name is Tony Kern. I'm a partner at Deloitte, and for those of you who don't know what Deloitte is, it's a global consulting, auditing, enterprise risk and tax firm. It's the largest in the world. The firm is aligned by industries, so there's a financial services sector, a consumer business sector, and the sector that I work in, which is technology, media, and telecommunications, which is the one of the largest of the 7 sectors in the firm. As I said, we're a pretty much a full-service advisory firm to the business. We spend a tremendous amount of the time with the big media and entertainment companies, and a lot of time with smaller, what we would call core companies and startups, especially here in Silicon Valley. We spend a lot of time focusing right now with big content producers around rights management, which Phil mentioned, which is, I know we keep talking about it, we've been talking about it for years, but There is a tremendous amount of effort and a lot of money going towards rights management and all the things around rights management, participations, residuals, all the different elements. Spending a lot of time doing that and optimizing what I would call legacy structures for some of the big media companies. Generally speaking, most big media companies aren't designed or set up now to operate in a digital environment. As you mentioned, everybody's experimenting with business models, and that's one of the things we're helping with, helping people optimize and experiment with business models. So that's a snapshot of what our media and entertainment practice is doing at Deloitte.
Larry?
Hi, I'm Larry Tanz, CEO of Live Planet. We are an entertainment company that creates and produces concepts for feature, film, television, online, and wireless. The company was founded 6 years ago. We're based in Santa Monica. Just a quick rundown of some projects that we have in those various areas. We also work a lot with brands to finance and promote our content. We did a feature film I exec produced for Universal called First Descent, which was fully financed by Pepsi Mountain Dew. That came out theatrically in December. We, in the television space, we've done 3 seasons of Project Greenlight, which is also the biggest online screenwriting directing competition, and we've done 3 feature films off of that. The third of which is called Feast, exec produced by Wes Craven, Matt Damon, and Ben Affleck, and coming out in October. In the wireless space, we recently announced a game called Phone Tag that we're launching with Amped Mobile. We previewed it at E3, and we're launching it in Japan, Canada, and the US at the end of the year. And it's sort of like paintball meets capture the flag meets gotcha, all played on your cell phone using the GPS capabilities of the phone. And then currently we're in production with MSN on the first MSN original, which is a show called Fan Club. If you go to fanclub.msn.com, you can check it out. And it is kind of Bull Durham meets fantasy sports, where the audience goes and gets to know the fun backstory behind a pro minor league team in Chicago. The hook is that you can also run the team. So every day, the fans, the audience goes to this website and determines who sits on the bench, who starts at first base, who's going to pitch this week, and that those decisions are handed down to the management of the team, and the team is currently playing. It's right outside Chicago every night. Thanks.
Eric from IBM Global Services, who's sitting here in place of Saul Berman. Glad to see you. You're a lot better looking than Saul.
Well, that's saying a lot, isn't it? Yes. Thank you. My name is Eric Mark. I'm a senior member of the Media Entertainment Strategy practice at IBM Global Services, yes, the other IBM. Focused primarily on new products, new businesses, new services, and worked over the last several years with most of the major studios, most of the major record companies, as well as a lot of digital distribution types of entities. Recent things worked on included talking to one of the major video retailers about how to get into new spaces like a Netflix model, a bit late to the table, but more importantly into VOD and things like that, as well as presenting our new paper, The End of Television as We Know It, to several panels like this, as well as some of our key clients and everyone ranging really from the telco trying to get into IPTV into smaller startup types of digital distribution entities. Really the big findings that came from that were the fact that traditional media isn't going away. Clearly it's being displaced to some extent, and new media is growing a lot faster, but we've got to focus on both of those channels, see how they're evolving, look at where the new revenue streams come from, those new business models my colleagues were talking about, particularly looking at things like where does advertising migrate to in the future, how do we optimize it, how do we use it best. One of the things that we looked at was just the big level types of segments that exist in the marketplace as a result of that, and came up with some of these larger groups like the massive passives, if you will, which are sort of the old school types of people, still wed to scheduled types of programming, looking at older devices going through television, as opposed to the gadgeteers, which is probably most of the people in this room, who really understand a lot more about technology, are early adopters, and want to start using those devices and content on a multitude of platforms. And then what we're also calling cool kids, which are more the younger groups, the people traditionally think of as the early adopters and the people changing the marketplace, but who in fact don't necessarily have the resources or money necessary to do that in the short term, so the people who would want to aspire to growing in the future. We have several recommendations that came out of that, including, as Tony and Shahid were saying, not just innovating, but also experimenting. And I think one of the key findings for us is that we are in this period of great experimentation. There will be winners and losers, but the important thing is that people go out there and actually try some of these new business models as well as just thinking about them.
Thanks for clarifying. I always thought massive passive meant people's weight issues.
Well, you're thinking about us all.
Great. David from Channel Blast.
Yes, my name is David Tochterman. I've been on the old media side for the past 15 years as a television producer. Produced shows for almost all the primetime and cable networks, including Roseanne, Grace Under Fire, Third Rock from the Sun, and That 70s Show when I was an executive with the Carsey Werner Company. The reason I'm here today is I'm now part of developing a company called Channel Blast, which is an online digital network creating original, contextually relevant content for advertisers and brands. We feel that we're trying to take advantage of the fact that broadband usage is exploding, viewers are online, advertisers want to control their own content, they want to reach those viewers, and to me, this is one of the most exciting times I could think of in the media business. The last time around, obviously, as I'm sure almost everybody in this room knows, there was some amazing stuff being put online by a variety of companies that were all, quite frankly, it was astounding stuff. I mean, it will go down in history as being, I think, some really special times. Obviously, the business models weren't quite mature yet. The difference this time around, obviously, is this time the advertisers are in the tent and very much a part of the process. And in a way, my colleague Janie Aronow, who is sitting over there from Aronow Communications, who actually founded this company and brought me in to help her develop it, we've been saying that in a lot of ways we find this part of the media business right now, it's a little bit like Back to the Future. Because certainly from the beginning of television, content was created to deliver viewers to sponsors. And the thing that's matured now is that those two things have met in what I think is a very exciting way, and that's why we're here.
So if we take parallels from the cable industry, HBO was started in 1972 when cable was in about 5 million households. CNN started in 80 when cable penetration reached about 17 million. So broadband is now in 50 million households. And a lot of what we're seeing today on broadband television it reminds me of when television first started and you had the radio people standing up on TV and just talking as if they're still on radio. What do you think is going to happen with broadband TV? And when I say broadband TV, I mean all aspects of it, including over-the-top internet-based TV, mobile, and then IPTV.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up radio, because I think that, coming, as I said, from the primetime television world, you're used to having a broad mentality going into this, where you want something that everybody can watch together in the living room and invite these people into their homes, and it's a much broader experience. I find that internet programming is actually much more like radio because it's very personal. And I think the key is to create it can't look like repurposed television. It can't look like something you can see in your living room. It's got to be something that's developed specifically for viewers that want to have a lean-forward experience with the content that they're viewing, something that engages them and they can interact with. And that's, I think, going to be the secret to the next generation of content that's created online.
Okay.
I certainly agree with that, and I think that one of the other points, we talked about this shift into more broadband TV and personalized experiences, and I talked about those different large level segments we were looking at, and it's really understanding as we deliver new content over those expanded channels what those segments are looking for. And so, for example, what I was calling the massive passives are still a large group and still very much a sit back, passive type of group, as their name would imply. Whereas the gadgeteers and the cool kids are much more lean forward and not just looking for interactive types of experiences, but really experiences that are immersive. And we see that not just in the screen types of displays like we're looking at with TV and broadband, but I mean, take like an IMAX type of experience, or what the movie exhibitors are going for, and just all this 3D and things that are going on right now. And it points to the fact that there is a market for and a desire for new types of experiences that really encompass all the senses that the viewer brings to the table. And I think that, as we move forward and look at building these types of channels and content systems, that we want to make sure that we understand who we're looking at and what they want specifically. And the one other thing I'll add to that is just we have to be very careful when we segment, that we don't just go after all segments blindly, that we realize that some segments are worth more than others, and that, in fact, some segments actually lose money. The last thing I'll say on that point is, as I'm sure a lot of people are aware in this room, Netflix, for example, the best segment, or their best customers, the people who rent the most per month, are actually their worst customers, and they lose money on every one of those people and try to actually give them worse service as a result. And I think that that's an important lesson as we look at where we're going with broadband television.
I agree with David and Erica, so I'll just add to what they said. I think one of the biggest changes will be the on-demand element of broadband. And we had a really interesting experience. We produced a show for MTV called The Gears of War, The Race to E3, and it was a documentary about the making of Xbox's big title for this year. And MTV ran it, and MTV2 ran it, and it also ran on MTV Overdrive and was the first original program on Xbox Live. And what we found was that it's continuing to run on Overdrive, and the numbers on Overdrive were as impressive as the numbers on MTV and MTV2. And the reason for that is particular. These guys refer to target demographics. That audience would rather go to their computer and watch the show whenever they want, and they continue to watch the show. And it's not necessarily appointment viewing. I think there'll always be sports, and there'll always be a few big shows that people kind of gather around and want to watch at the same time. But otherwise, with broadband and IP delivery, on-demand becomes a huge piece of all this, and I think that's going to be probably the biggest change in consumer behavior.
Yeah, I guess I look at it in two fairly big buckets. There's the content side, certainly, and then there's a delivery capture mechanism side. I think most people will tell you on the content side that I guess maybe you even talk of it in terms of experience, right? The 10-foot experience, the 2-foot experience, and whatever the iPod-like experience is, whether that's a foot or whatever it happens to be. So content generally needs to be shaped or at least cued for different experiences. And once you start working through those different experiences, you certainly need to look at the devices it's going to be delivered to. I think in the home there needs to be, and we're getting to the point where there'll be a fused device that it's, everything comes into the house, and we need more speed in the house and better bandwidth in the house. But everything comes into the house and it's distributed in the house. Right now, even though my house is connected, it's a complete mess of wires and wireless and everything else. So some sort of fusion device in the house has to happen just to make it easier. So no matter where it comes in, you can view it anywhere in the home. And then there's wireless, of course. Wireless is the other piece of this. And if you look at IMS and the types of things that the phone companies and the wireless providers are thinking about putting in place around multimedia subsystems, which will make it easier. It's just clear to me there's two big buckets. There's the content bucket, and then there's basically the technical piece of it. And I think we're, frankly, at an early stage on both of those, even though we're all very excited about it. And obviously there's a lot of people here, but that's where the opportunity is right now.
It's a good segue for you, Phil.
Yeah, sure. Just going back to your timeline, one of the interesting parallels to that in terms of the number of users passed as new networks evolved is also the amount of content available to those users on those networks as that evolved. So if you go back to traditional broadcast TV, you had this many channels, you get to cable TV, you get into the tens, and once you're in those 50 million homes passed, you're at the millions of pieces of content. So one of the key elements of this market going forward clearly is going to be navigation. And I've heard a lot today and over the last couple of years around personalization of the television experience. And I think that ultimately, from a navigation standpoint, the ability not to deliver more amount of content, they need the right content to map onto the viewing hours per week that they have. The ability to unlock what is an incredible breakthrough in terms of the amount of content, the diversity of content, the focus of that content, but the ability to unlock that potential and really shift the industry is ultimately going to come down to our ability to effectively deliver that to the consumer through a navigation premise that is very different than what we have today. And I think that ultimately you see that emerging but the economics, and particularly the economics around current operators, cable companies, satellites, and the like, the economics around what they can do in the confines of a set-top box are going to ultimately be a limitation on the market. So ultimately, with broadband TV, we need a shift in that last mile, that last service provider, that last aggregator to make it work. Now, we looked at Media Center PCs and similar devices, and through either a Media Center PC in a living room or a digital media adapter, that was going to shift the industry. But the reality is that was a failure, because when I had to understand what a WEP key was or a subnet mask so I could watch Law & Order in the bedroom, it's not going to work that well. And I think that's proven out to be a challenge. So ultimately, I think new opportunities in the market rest on a vertical integration and a clear focus on that living room experience. Not trying to shove a PC experience or a lean forward experience or a web browser experience into the living room, but taking the best of that world. And I would highlight what Larry had said. On-demand is the key behavior shift. Consumers that experience on-demand ultimately very rapidly shift to an on-demand behavior, and I think I'll quote some bad stats. Of the consumers that are exposed to on-demand, they, within a matter of 4 weeks, convert 80+% of their viewing time to on-demand. So it's a very easy shift in consumer behavior, and ultimately that kind of shift is what breaks a market open. So I do think that on-demand, with a combination of access to this large amount of content through a new experience, is what's going to make broadband TV go mainstream. Because I'd really hate to see all this innovation on the content side be stuck in a browser window. I'd really love to see that get on the main screen and get into the living room as quickly as possible, and that's when it's going to get really exciking.
You know, you mentioned search, and search is just an enormous component of all this. And I remember back in the days when they were building 220 megahertz cable systems. These are 10 and 12 channel cable systems, and there were only 3 networks. And people were worried that who's going to watch, you know, the other X channels, and how people would navigate that and find it. And in this world today, your ability to navigate, which is one of the major problems that has to be solved right now, it's a huge issue for people. That's why we predicted this year that search would surpass email as the most digitally used application, and it's happening right now. They're crossing over each other, which when you think of the number of emails sent just around the world, search is finally passing that. So it's just
I like the Jerry Seinfeld line. He says that people don't like to see what's on TV, they like to see what else is on TV. So yeah, I totally agree with you. So how do you think the search part of it will evolve? How will people go and find the content they want to watch in the limited amount of time they have for entertainment from these millions of options that are out there on broadband?
Do you want to go?
Yeah. Sure. Well, I actually think that... That was a good ringtone, though. I think that search is actually a problem for the living room. I think if we do it well, what we'll now we think of as channel surfing and bouncing around a linearly programmed 2x2 grid is going to turn into a browsable navigation experience in which the service itself has built some intelligence in how they rank and deliver that browse experience to the end user. That's the ideal, but that presumes that you've effectively tagged and organized and related all that content that you're trying to get to, which ultimately I think is the biggest challenge for the industry, is the metadata. We have, and we dealt with this, frankly, going back to being the sage of the music industry. The biggest challenge of getting digital music online, a lot of it was just being able to get the right data to describe what the music was. And ultimately getting the right data to relate that music to one another so you could display it in a good way was a huge challenge. And ultimately I think that the video industry overall is going to go down the same path. They're going to have to, either third parties will do it, certainly the content companies themselves won't do it, just because it's not really economically sensible for them to do it. Somebody has to come up with a good metadata system, and then also a way to relate that metadata to create a new experience.
So in this 1,000-channel universe, or almost an unlimited channel universe, it creates problems for a lot of different people. It creates problems for our content people, right? Because if there isn't an ABC, a CBS, an NBC, and a Fox, or a handful of cable channels that people watch regularly, how are you going to get your next show out, right? So it becomes an issue, it becomes a marketing and public relations and promotion issue. Also becomes a big issue for advertisers and the entire support structure, whether it's subscription or ad-based or whatever it happens to be. So we actually create more problems, as we go forward in this almost what could be an unlimited channel universe.
Anybody else on search?
Just to highlight just how important search is, and I don't think this is a surprise to anybody, but as the 24-hour day gets filled with more and more content, more and more choices, both in devices and channels, there's not more viewing being done. And one of the things that we found a few years ago was that as we expanded from 30 stations to 80 on our way to several hundred, was that more than twice the channels were available, and yet people's viewing only went up about 8 minutes a day. And it points to what these guys are saying, that absolutely there needs to be some way to start determining for people which content not only is out there, but which content is best suited for them. And I think that we've seen the early versions of things through these different IPGs, through the things that people have done on PVRs and everything else, but that there really has to be something that starts saying that this isn't just content that's worthwhile, it's content that's specifically worthwhile for you. And as Tony was saying, it leads back into however we support this, be it through advertising or subscription revenues, that it turns into some type of business model that's viable for whoever starts doing that. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the content providers or the deliverers of content, but someone has to step in there either as an intermediary or as a partner of one of those groups in order to bring that to the consumers.
Right. When I talk to the networks, what we talk about, and you mentioned this earlier, it's basically distribution platforms, and there's a hierarchy of distribution platforms that's emerging. I think the legacy broadcast platforms are intact. I mean, they're changing and evolving, but they're relatively intact. So you have a core legacy broadcast platform. You've got cable, which is obviously moved into that platform and basically is a core distributor of programming. And then there's the internet, and some of the cable companies are experimenting with their own bypass systems off cable broadband. So it's a handful of platform and platform distribution issues, and they need to be ranked, and they need to be understood as far as economics of those distribution platforms. When do you are you day and date releasing, or are you, is it time and again? Is it the next day? How are you charging? So there's a whole ton of business models that have to be understood and put together as you go through all your different platforms.
Now, from what I understand, you're saying that each platform will have its own unique experience. Do you also think there will be some interplay between the different platforms?
Well, I think there will be. I can see a time actually, and I'm not sure if it's 2 years or 10 years from now, when you'll be able to watch the first run of a TV show on, say, NBC on the network released over the cable system at the same time it comes up in wireless. That's entirely possible, but right now they're afraid of cannibalization because they don't understand the advertising model yet. They're still struggling with how to make you pay for it, and that's why you see, in most cases, older shows or shows that have been broadcast already that you can pick up for $1.99 somewhere. If it was released day and date at the same time on a handful of different platforms, that's going to change the model as well. So people just have to experiment with a handful of different models. And I think we're talking about experimentation and innovation, and I think our key recommendation is don't punish the people who fail, right? Everybody I think in kind of the legacy infrastructures is so anxious because it's just built into the way they've been for 50 years to beat the living hell out of failure. And right now, we need innovation. We need a lot of innovation, and you can't kill the guy who failed. He may have the next great idea, but that's what it's going to take to kind of navigate through this.
Yeah, there are a few industries that are as fearful of change as the broader industry that we're all involved in, and it's amazing how often people reject new business models and let other people slip in. Certainly we saw that in the music space, and one client I can mention is Napster, and it was interesting that when we worked with developing the business plan for the new paid Napster, and I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, we didn't know iTunes was coming out at the time, but having said that, it was shocking in dealing with the record labels. They didn't want anything to do with it initially because they thought that this is something that's just cannibalistic and that it's going to cause them to lose sales. Not realizing that if they didn't do it, somebody else would do it or something like it, and it caused the same type of problems for them. And certainly we've seen that in filmed entertainment. Every time.
Have you spoken to the home video guys lately?
Yes, I've spoken to the home video people a lot. And to their credit, Shahid, I mean, the home video people are being more open, having learned some of the lessons that the music industry went through. Having said that, are they doing enough? I don't think you can ever do enough, and I think that there's still opportunity to try a lot of new things and really look at the past history again. When television came in, people thought that was going to destroy filmed entertainment. When VCRs came in, people thought that would destroy television. Certainly when DVDs came around, people thought that would destroy the business model for everything. And all of these have been additive. Now, having said that, everyone points to the fact that these are additive revenues, but there is someone who loses out in those things. Obviously, VHS declined in terms of where DVD sell-through went to. It killed video rental stores, and that market continues to decline. But you have to embrace the change. You have to understand that that there is an opportunity, And again, that if it doesn't come from the industry itself, it's going to come from outside of the industry. There's going to be new players, new competitors, and sometimes people with more resources than the current players have today.
There's a good lesson to be learned there too, is that for the content guys, I try to tell them, just remember the technology guys just keep killing each other as they build these new platforms. The content industry just keeps growing as each new platform evolves. So if anybody should be afraid of new technology, it's the technology guys, because they're going to eat one another. But and I think, fortunately for the video industry, they did see what happened on the music side of the business. And the reality is, if they wouldn't have gotten proactive and jumped into supporting digital music, begrudgingly by many, and I was at Sony Music at the time and cut the deal with Steve Jobs, so I was there having discussions with the label heads to just try and get that off the ground. The reality is their business would be down 20%, whereas it's kind of just flat right now. So it is a big opportunity for the content companies. Just another comment on, which I think is a key game changer here, is what happens with advertising. Ultimately, the economics of the industry and what's going to work from a content standpoint is how advertising and the economics of advertising shift as you get on demand, you get highly personalized, and you build these channels. As we know, the broadcast TV advertising base is dropping year after year. In particular, local broadcast TV is dropping even faster. The ability for them to micro-tune into markets ultimately is going to effectively let them compete more with what's happening with not just broadband TV, but broadband internet in general. So I think if there is an embracing of this new medium and an aggressive experimentation with new channels, particularly focused on the advertising model, which I think ultimately is a long-term play here, that's going to be very interesting for the industry.
So David and Larry, do you agree with that from a content perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Phil just said about technology kind of being the friend to the content provider. I mean, as I mentioned, this Gears of War show that we did, we shot it in high def, and when I saw it on MTV Overdrive, I was amazed at how good it looked. The quality was absolutely amazing. In fact, it ran in high def on Xbox Live, so it looked better online than it did on MTV. And I started to realize, because I do believe that people are going to watch Superman or big action movies on the big screen, and then there'll be some other content that's better suited for a cell phone. But there's the majority of the content's in the middle, and I would include all television and almost everything you see on YouTube as it gets better, especially. And so as the quality of the video and the production quality starts to go up, all of a sudden you can have pretty much the same experience anywhere. And so, I mean, it ties back to the on-demand experience, but also it's just, do you need something special to watch something on your cell phone or on the computer? I don't know. I mean, because in 3 to 4 years, the stuff you see on YouTube, probably half of it will be shot on high def. It's going to look really good. So if you can get it onto your plasma screen in your living room, your LCD monitor on your computer, or on your cell phone, and it kind of looks equally good, I think users will consume the same stuff everywhere, along with the things optimized for particular platforms. But again, it's like if you can sit and watch, an episode of The Office or some sitcom, which doesn't need to look good, but it's shot in high def and you're seeing it at high resolution on your TV or on your cell phone or on your PC. I didn't believe this a few years ago, but I actually believe it now, that people will consume this content on any of the platforms pretty much equally, because it kind of it's starting to look the same wherever you go. Again, with the exception of the $100 million feature films, which will always look better on the big screen.
David?
Well, I still believe the content is king. I still think you need to make product that people want to watch. And I think that, we've sort of created a generation of auteurs now that everybody's creating their own content. And again, our model is specifically ad-driven. So, I'm not so sure that some of the more, down to the ground, user-driven stuff is really our model. I don't think that the brands would be looking to have user content affiliated with their message. I do think that you still, at the end of the day, need to sort of be able to cut through the clutter with content that people want to watch. And I think that people will find a way to watch it, regardless of of which device they choose to watch it on. I mean,
you think YouTube is hype? It's going to go away?
I would never sort of go that far. I just think that the question is, they are now trying to develop what their business plan is, because they need to find a way to get the advertisers in. Other companies are trying different ways to attach advertising to user content and share that revenue with the creators. I mean, look, I mean, we're sort of much closer to the beginning than the end of that story, I think. I think right now it's a phenomenon, you know, trying to become a successful business. I mean, it's an amazing phenomenon. I'm not so sure that it's applicable to an ad-driven model at this point.
What general perspective on user-generated content?
Well, I just want to, you know, Shahid, to your question, you know, is YouTube a fad or will YouTube go away? I mean, my position is user-generated content will continue to grow, but if any of us had a website and we got a hold of the new Paris Hilton scandal video, we could be YouTube.
Please send it to me when you get it.
Yeah, but you know, we could be YouTube in a year. You know, there's no barrier to entry at all. All it is a place where a bunch of people happen to start to gather, and they had some great stuff up front that everybody wanted to come see, and so they had free marketing. So, you know, I think YouTube's an amazing company, but I'd be really, really scared if I were them, because there's no barriers to entry. None of their content is cleared, or, you know, a lot of it's not even really legal if you look at it, you know, under the microscope and determine whether all the music and all the appearances and all that are cleared. So it's hard to sell, you know, big advertisers around content that's not necessarily, you know, licensed. And you know, in the world that we did 3 seasons of Project Greenlight, and we got thousands and thousands of videos and screenplays and all that. And I think one thing I will say is, you know, there's a ton of really creative people out there, but it is the law of large numbers. I mean, you need a huge gathering of stuff to find just you know, just a couple of diamonds in the rough, because, you know, everyone's empowered out there, has their cell phone camera, has their video camera, whatever, but still, you got to make content that people want to watch, and 99.9% of the stuff that people are shooting in their basement or of their buddy skateboarding isn't stuff people want to watch. But with the law of large numbers, if you get, you know, 1 or 2 good clips a day, you could have 5 million people watching them, and then you have something. So I guess, thank God we live in a big country.
No, and when I look at those numbers, I always wonder, who are these people?
Yeah.
I don't know who these people are.
I also thought it was interesting that it took so long for the networks and the studios to embrace the phenomenon of YouTube. I mean, it seemed to me that when that story broke about how NBC wanted to go after YouTube because they ran Lazy Sunday on there, my first thought was that it was Barnum and Bailey time. I thought they should be Lorne Michaels should be so lucky as to have the YouTube audience turned on by a clip from Saturday Night Live. Most of the young generation has sort of thought Saturday Night Live was kind of past its peak years ago. So when I first heard that I had this image that there was somebody in a boardroom in Burbank asking themselves, who the hell are these guys? Why are we suing them? You know,
Yeah,
it seemed that, and then shortly thereafter they announced that, oh yeah, we love YouTube. We want them to run.
They realize YouTube has no money and they can't do anything.
But I think it does point to 2 things. Once again, it reiterates the need for, you know, intelligent search and really being able to focus through these things, find the things that are most relevant to the appropriate consumers. And it also points to, as Larry was saying, to this notion that, you know, not all content is good, and not all content really deserves to be out there, or needs to be. Having said that, it's fine that it's out there, but whether or not it's going to get an audience, to your point, really is, you know, is the big question, and whether there's any type of business model to sustain that. And I think that, you know, there's analogies to when interactive TV first was talked about, for example, like some of these ideas of self-programming in terms of sports. Sure, seeing a few different angles is interesting, but there's a reason that there's professional directors putting together those shows. And there was one experiment that I don't know if everyone's familiar with. I guess they had the audience call in the plays. So there was a headphone in the quarterback's helmet, and they'd have the audience just vote on what they should do next. And obviously, that failed miserably. And I think that, you know, it's analogous to what some of the things we're talking about might be.
I'll ask a couple of questions and open it up for the audience. What's your take on T-commerce? We're seeing the site launched by Universal, where you have music videos and you can purchase stuff off of those. There's a French designer that has launched a T-commerce website with some really provocative content, and you can click on the outfits that people are wearing and purchase them. We heard this whole story 10 years ago when interactive TV was going to be big. Mm-hmm. What's your take on T-commerce?
I mean, our model is, again, directly linked to the advertisers that are sponsoring our shows. We have one of our shows is called Room 1015. It's directly sponsored by Tower Records. And on that show, you can click and purchase music from the bands that are appearing on that show. It's fairly simple. It's not complicated. If you watch the show and you like what you see, you can purchase the product. I think one of the, obviously, look, a lot of us are bombarding the audience with a lot of content and a lot of options, and one of our strategies has been to try to keep it as simple as we can for the viewers, because there's nothing simpler than that. If you like what you see, you can buy it. And it just seems that so far, at least certainly for Tower Records purposes, that's worked really well for us.
Yeah, I agree with David. I mean, this is all about the advertisers, and everyone up here has mentioned it, but that's really where all the money is here. I mean, there's probably a pay per download market out there somewhere, but it's all about where do the advertisers want to spend their money. But in regards specifically to the question, I think this is a case of people just being in love with technology. It's like, just because I can click on the sweater that Jennifer Aniston is wearing, which is, by the way, the same example they were using like 6 years ago, doesn't mean I want to while I'm watching an episode of Friends. I mean, it's just a high-tech solution for a low-tech problem. Like, you could also have a website with just like HTML that has pictures of the things that were on the show and a link, and you can click on that. So again, it's like the technology falling in love with what it can do, and the consumer not really caring that much. But I think the advertiser-driven stuff is very compelling. So if you're Victoria's Secret and you do a runway show that's very sexy and racy, and you put it out on the web and hundreds of thousands of people download it, that's a huge advertisement for your product. And the stuff that David's doing, I think, is right along those lines. Instead of content being created to entertain consumers and then trying to just interrupt it to do sales off it, create content that is pushing the product and that's entertaining, so people know, okay, I'm going to go watch this beach volleyball tournament, and Oakley is sponsoring it and they paid for it and everybody's wearing Oakleys, and I know I can look at Oakleys and buy them afterwards.
Right. One of the, in the unlimited channel universe, every advertiser theoretically could have their own channel, right? And one of the things we've been telling ad agencies is you basically have to become program producers at some point to draw people in. So the Victoria's Secret channel is a good example, but there's lots of examples like that. And if you're in a broadband TV environment or an IPTV environment, which is one of the big theoretical selling points and business models around IPTV, is this unlimited channel universe and the ability to hotspot products and items and get more information. But I agree with you. I don't know how many people are going to want to sit there during the show and point and click on items during the show while they're watching it. But that's theoretically one of the big selling points around IPTV at this point. So.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that there's the bifurcation of an entertainment experience and a purchase experience is clear, but the ability to create a purchase experience in a television environment is also clear. QVC and HSN have done a great job of that, and I guess I heard today that Cablevision and HSN just announced that they're going to move beyond just telephone purchase to something you can do directly interactively via the remote, which I think is interesting. So that form of T-commerce, where you're setting up an environment and an entertainment experience centered around purchasing, is going to get more compelling because it's going to get easier to do, particularly when you have a payment mechanism and consumers are trained that they can use their service provider bill, not unlike an iTunes credit card that's in their account. They can use that as a payment mechanism. So reducing that friction, I think, will be interesting, but ultimately I don't think merging commerce in with the middle of an entertainment experience is really going to fly.
So other than the cost of content itself, the biggest component, from what I understand, is the content distribution cost. Your Akamai's of the world are doing quite well. What's your take on the future of the cost aspects of delivering content on broadband? Well, you want to start.
Well, yeah, clearly, content creation costs are coming down dramatically through the, use of new technologies, the cost of the equipment going down, and production getting much cheaper. So I think the production side of it ultimately will get cheaper. Now, when you get to the high end of the industry, obviously the talent costs are going to overweight a lot of what's involved there. I do think content ultimately is going to get cheaper on average, but I think, it's really going to depend on how split up the viewership gets in terms of that being true. One of the interesting elements of this in terms of building out new TV delivery infrastructures is look at what's happened with the telcos. I mean, at this point, the numbers I understand is that Verizon to roll fiber is about $1,000 per home passed. And if they convert 10 or 15% of their audience, they've just sunk 10 grand into each customer that they've converted. So it's going to take them, what, 50 years to get that money back? So I'd say it really, from an infrastructure standpoint, it depends ultimately on how you build out your infrastructure. And that could, if you do it the wrong way, overweigh your business and overweight the overall business.
But that's the fixed cost. You still have the streaming cost, the CDN cost, content delivery network cost, which is variable, and you can potentially lose money on every piece of content viewed.
Right.
So where do you see that going?
Well, I think if we live in an entirely unicast universe where everybody streams on demand from a single server node, the market won't scale. And if you look at any of the primetime TV events that have taken place on the internet to date, it proves out there's still several, and I would say maybe 3 or 4 orders of magnitude below what is the traditional media, and it costs them an incredible amount of money to put those on. So my argument there is if it is a unicast universe, it's not going to scale up to be a traditional medium. So there has to be some innovation, again, looking at on-demand and looking at smart technologies to distribute the load across a bunch of users. And I don't just mean peer-assisted delivery. I think that's interesting as a underlying platform, but even in that environment, depending on the end technologies that you use, it may or may not work. So my point there is simply that if you think everybody's just going to stream it off a server whenever they want it, and that's going to create economics that work, you're wrong.
And infrastructure is not to be, I mean, he mentioned infrastructure, it's not to be underestimated. If you're Verizon or if you're the new AT&T or any one of the big cable companies and you're putting in some of the advanced fiber systems right now, the paybacks are 50. One point I heard an analyst say over 100 years in the case of one of the phone companies. And I didn't hear the CEO deny it either, but he's building the telephone system for the next 100 years. And effectively, that's the only way to explain the cost and the return at this point.
Yeah, I mean, my expertise isn't in the delivery side, but on the content production side, I do agree with Phil that on average, content production costs are going down, but I would caveat that with professional content production costs aren't really going down that much. So you have tons and tons of very low cost content out there, and so there's more cheaper content. But when you try to do a high quality production, even if it's on the web, as I said in the beginning, the production values and the quality on the web is getting so good that people don't want to see this security cam style footage, and they don't want to see, you know, blurry like home VHS video stuff anymore. So the costs actually, just like in reality TV, when reality TV shows first came out, they were really cheap. And then as the talent pool started to be more taxed and the expectations for quality started to go up, you know, a big reality show on a network can cost as much as a drama. So those costs haven't really changed. So just wanted to make that point.
Eric, in all the work that you do around business modeling, how do you mitigate the content distribution cost?
Well, to be honest, we haven't entirely mitigated at this point. As my colleagues have been mentioning, we've been working with some of the MSOs and the telcos and looking into, you know, what is the right solution for them. And you know, with some of the telcos that have been mentioned today, it's a serious issue. And as I'm sure people saw just in the papers yesterday, Verizon trying to essentially bring IPTV around New York City amongst other markets, and the extreme cost that's involved in that. You know, Tony's right. It's not necessarily building something that's a return on investment in the short term. It's something that's being built as, quite honestly, in their case, something of a defensive move, as they feel that they're under pressure from the MSOs and the other people getting into these quad play types of offerings. And whether or not that's going to pay back dividends in the short term really depends on whether or not they're able to get the market share they need, prevent the loss that they have today to their competitors, but more importantly start taking some of their business as well. And quite honestly, in order to do that, they're going to need to demonstrate that they can do some of this better than they've been doing before. One of the big issues that they face that the MSOs don't face is just getting those content deals in place. And Verizon and AT&T have actually done a pretty good job of starting to get those pieces put together. They've hired people out of the studios. They've got people who understand both ad buying and content buying, but they still don't have, you know, the suite of, or the palette of different types of offerings that some of the more traditional competitors have, and whether or not they'll be able to succeed in that marketplace really is still up for question.
But even what they're trying to launch, based on our analysis, is going to be at par with what cable offers today. And they'll probably launch that over the next several months. They're assuming that the cable companies will not try and get innovative and launch something that competes with them. So these billions of dollars they're spending on IPTV, I'm not sure if anything will come out of it.
And I don't disagree with that. I think that they view it as, again, as both an opportunity but as a defensive move in a place that's becoming increasingly competitive. And I think it goes back to what some of the others had said earlier. In some ways, it's difficult being on the technology side or the provisionment side, because you really are just up against all of these competitors coming up and trying to do essentially the same thing that you're trying to do. And in some ways, what you were saying, David, again, it just points to content, if it's used right, still being king, the experience being the ultimate driver of what brings the eyeballs, and having to have something that's very compelling in order to make people switch to some other service. And what I expect will happen, quite honestly, is that they will launch pricing wars, that they'll start bringing down the overall cost of the bundles of your telephony, your wireless, and your television and your internet, and then the MSOs will respond in kind, and all that will do is drive margins down out of the industry, or both industries as a whole.
So hopefully they'll make money in the volume.
Well, that's the hope, and that's sort of the business model. But we'll see. Maybe in this 100-year time frame, that'll come to pass.
Well, not in 100 years. So let's open it up for questions. Your name and your company name.
I'm Scott Davis with Hewlett Packard. It seems like there's a great lesson to be learned from the record industries, from the recording industries, on bundling and unbundling, the power of that. It used to be in the old days when I was first getting into rock and roll, I'd get a great album for $20 and like one song, and the rest of it was crap. And that's how I feel about cable and satellite today. I watched 3 shows. I got 200 channels and nothing more. And I would love nothing more than to be able to go to a site and be able to have first-party content programmed with 3 things that I like, and be able to pay what I feel like fair price for that, and download it, and get rid of the other 197 channels that I watch. So it seems from a customer usage perspective that the content providers are going to figure out a way to monetize that, right, and deliver it directly, that they could replace the revenue streams you're selling to these. So there's a question. The question is what from the push side guys, Comcast, and satellite guys going forward, given the pressure that we're seeing, the results that we saw from unbundling content in the record business, and now a huge shift from that to downloading single songs on the iTunes, and some of the government pressures coming from government to do unbundling as well. So it seems like there's conversion pressure from the market again.
So the cameraman asked me to repeat the question, and I just can't repeat it. So
What of the pushback guys?
Right. Well, Kevin Martin, chairman at the FCC, backed off a bit. Remember, there was that whole period there where everybody in the cable business was scared that everything would be a la carte, which is basically what you want. Over broadband TV, that's entirely possible, right? But it still becomes a navigation issue. How do you find it? You can buy what you want, when you want it, where you want it, and then have rights to view it like you want. And I think the chance of that happening soon in cable, just because of the way cable is built and the way the capital markets are set up and the way expectations are set up, I think the chance of that happening in cable TV in any time in the near future is pretty slim. A lot of it's economic, a lot of it's capital markets driven. A lot of it is contractually driven through the way they pick up programming. But I think in broadband TV that will happen. And eventually I think cable will move to more of that type of model. Remember the arguments when the government came out and said, we want all this a la carte, is the strongest argument, which wasn't a great argument, was the least watched channels will actually go away if we go to a la carte. And somebody said in Congress, that's why they're the least watched channels. But we know what happened, right? That got dropped and traded for something.
Tony, based on our analysis, my company's analysis, at least at the current price points, the profitability on electronic sell-through is significantly higher than ad-supported content. What's your take on the future of EST or rental or VOD on broadband TV?
In my view, in broadband TV, I think that's the model you evolve to. I think that's where you get to. I think that will be the predominant model. Someone has to organize it and aggregate it. This is back to the navigation issue, so you can find your shows and your programs, even though you may be distributing in other places as well. But I think it's an organization and aggregation issue for broadband TV. Right, there will be a broadband TV channel you can go to, which may have, or you might be able to customize the shows you want it and buy it through a package or buy it a la carte over the internet. It's entirely possible. So I think that's what we'll have.
I would agree with that. I think the big change there is going to be the home video departments of the picture studios competing with the pay TV departments and really figuring out which of those is going to work. Ultimately, one thing I'm interested in is whether iTunes Video effectively migrates to a living room environment through an operator or not. Clearly, pay-per-view as it stands now is not really taking off in the way that people had expected. And I do ultimately think that it's going to be advertising supported for the bulk amount of viewing, but the average cost per consumer for that subscription advertising supported delivery is going to go down dramatically, and building on top of that is going to be a whole lot more VOD, electronic sell-through. Even though electronic sell-through implies permanence, and there's no way to get permanence in the living room, but just say it is an iTunes Video thing, I think that's going to build on top of it. And that's going to be, just like DVD was, a huge growth opportunity for the pay TV parts of the content studios.
Isn't that what the Apple set-top box is trying to solve?
Yeah, but that's putting a PC in a living room. That's not getting a service provider to deliver it in there. And ultimately, you could argue that those PC-based services will migrate to the living room. I just frankly don't believe it's going to be the biggest driver in the near term. Converting I think you said massive passive consumers and giving them access to on-demand and unbundling and electronic sell-through, that's a huge opportunity for the market and primarily, again, for the content industry.
It's a big effort too, and I think one of the things that you always talk to people about is this multi-generational issue. So people who are 50, my daughters who are 25, their cousins who are 14, all consume differently, and you can see the way they play, the way they learn, the way they consume is different. So you have to keep that in mind as you're building out these systems and who you're marketing to and who are you trying to educate and what are you trying to change. It takes years to do it, but the generational issue is not to be ignored.
One of the other things I think this drives to, and I'll be brief, is just the commodification of a lot of these downstream pieces. So, for example, the delivery side or the devices and all of these things. Right now, essentially iTunes exists so that Steve Jobs can sell iPods, which is fine, and actually make reasonable margins in those. But we've seen prices come down on those. Learn from mistakes with the Mac, not trying to price it outside of the market. But the reality is that makes it a lot lower margin product than it was 2 years ago, and certainly as we go forward, we'll see continued things happen with that, in your particular example. And one of the things that's interesting, as much as it seems as online music is somewhat saving the record industry and bringing them back, still accounts for a relatively small part of the overall revenues, and those revenues that are there are very, very low margin for the people doing the distribution. So the studios are taking, or the record companies are taking such a large portion of it, that it leaves razor-thin margins, and essentially what presumably we'll see is the equivalence of the digital Walmarts or the digital Best Buys getting in and displacing the pure play guys.
Hi, I'm Bradley from Azerius, and I noticed on the panel we started off talking about on-demand content and the viewer having control over their viewing time. And then we ended the panel talking about advertising. To me, as a consumer, those two things don't necessarily jive. I have a TiVo because I want to be able to watch content and edit that content so I watch it in the most efficient manner. And I understand that we need to have advertisers to pay for that content. So what I'm interested in is understanding, barring product placements or actually applying a banner ad on top of a television show, what are you hearing from advertisers and content creators about the future of that market?
Well, right, we all know what TiVo did. It time shifted, place shifted. If you sling box it, it can be on the other side of the world. So it destroyed for the most part, it destroyed the current ad structure. And what people are looking for now is dynamic ad insertion, some way to interrupt that kind of destructive behavior that TiVo, for the ad market anyway, that TiVo initiated. So people are looking for dynamic ad insertion, not only in video, but in audio and in games, which we know is happening now as well. The somebody's got to figure out the support structure, whether you're going to pay 99 cents or whatever it happens to be to view that show, or but if somebody's advertising a Ford F-150 and the sale expires at the end of the month and you just watch this show on the first day of the next month, that ad is shot, or you blew through it in some way. that ad is shot. So the whole support structure begins to collapse. That's probably the biggest worry right now. You know, I don't think consumers are going to put up with banner ads running through the programs. You wouldn't put up with that. I know I wouldn't. So I think people are experimenting with those structures right now, but that's a big problem to be solved. I think that the irony is that most of us in this business, and probably many of us in this room, are probably an advertiser's nightmare. We're clicking away from every banner ad and every pop-up, and you know that's what we do. We're trying to view things in every way we can to avoid the advertising. And so I think that the emerging model is going to be something that is a response to that. I mean, you can't trick the viewer into accepting advertising. You've got to create content that is relevant to the brand vibe and create content that viewers will choose to watch, not be tricked into watching. I really think I think you're going to see a rise in even greater experimentation with that kind of content. I agree with you. And I think that companies like ours and others that we know that are out there are responding to it in a way that meets that need. It's like paying to go see a film. If it's good enough, you'll.
Well, yeah. I mean, I want to pick up on a couple of those points. So I agree with David. I mean, it's really hard to do to come up with content that just fits perfectly with advertisers. Like when we did this First Descent movie, it was this big snowboarding epic, and Shaun White was in it, and it was just like the perfect storm for Mountain Dew, and it just hit on all their cylinders, and it worked for them. But those are really, really hard to do and really hard to replicate. And there's a really not so nice picture of the world if you play this thing out. And I agree with you 100% that time shifting and advertising don't work. If you can afford to buy yourself around the advertising. So imagine a world where people with money can pay not to see ads and everybody else has to watch the crappy ad-supported stuff. You know, it's like listening to the radio on the, you know, that you get on the airplane. It's like, it's horrible, you know. So just imagine that world. And ironically, the rich people that can pay to do it on demand and not watch the ads are exactly the market that all the advertisers want. So that's a little messed up. And then you have, it's like this regressive tax. And I'm not like trying to kill the free market economy, but if you just play it out to an extreme, and then you have all these lower income people who are forced to watch these ads for, you know, crappy food and products and things like that, they just have to watch it. You know, it's like those free email services that came out, and you know, I don't know how popular they are now, where you could like get a free email account, but you had to watch a gazillion ads for like, you know, for brokerage houses and for, you know, mortgage houses and things like that. It's a really horrible experience, and I think, you know, the country and the world is going to start to split into the haves and the have-nots, and the haves are going to be able to do, you know, on demand, watch whatever they want, when they want it, buy a movie ticket, pay for it. And the have-nots are going to be watching, you know, hundreds and hundreds of ads just to get to the stuff that, you know, might not even be that good. I hope it doesn't happen that way, but it could. I mean, I could see it.
I think the one other point I was going to
bring everybody down, you know.
Add to that, though, was that, you know, as markets become more targeted, as we start looking at the segments more closely, there is more of an opportunity to start putting in types of advertising people are more interested in. Does that mean everyone's going to watch the ads that are directed to them? No, of course not. But the magazine industry wouldn't exist if people skipped over all the ads they could skip over. Clearly, people are actually looking at some of the ads that are in those magazines or in newspapers and things like that. And it points to the fact that if there is better advertising, I know that's a broad and simple thing to say, but a difficult thing to execute upon. But if there's better advertising, there's going to be more people consuming that advertising. The one other thing I'd say is, for example, I lived in France for a while, and there they actually show, you know, there's advertisements before the trailers, and they say what the times are on the marquees. It tells you when you sit down to watch the ads and then when the actual movie starts, and people go and watch the ads. Does that mean, well, we're not French, but having said that, there's still people who, there is a market for people who want to look at things. And the other point is, having said that, you know, if the business model doesn't evolve, if advertising no longer supports these things, you know, to what Larry was saying, then we won't be getting that content. And at a certain point, there has to be something that pays for it, and consumers will have to adopt or adapt.
But I like the way Larry has added content, free content, to the Maslow's pyramid after food, hunger, and shelter. But don't you think the fundamental reason is because French ads are actually more entertaining than what we see here?
I actually do believe that, but that's the point. There is better forms of there are better forms of advertising. It is possible to make things that are both more targeted, but also more entertaining. advertising itself is a form of content, and the quicker that some of our advertisers realize that, I think the better that they'll be doing in the marketplace.
But they do to a certain extent.
Absolutely.
I mean, when you watch the Super Bowl, you're looking forward to those. You want to see. I mean, the people creating some of this stuff are at the top of their game. I mean, some of this stuff's great. It's not crappy advertising. It's good advertising.
Absolutely. And I think that, to your point, Super Bowl is a great example of where there are a bunch of people who watch the game to watch the ads, as opposed to the other way around. And I think that that's hopefully a trend in that sense, but it hasn't trickled down to the general advertising.
The business generally has done a pretty poor job of understanding who the customer and viewer is, actually. Cable people, the MSOs, have done a pretty bad job at that, and I think that's got to change. And I know his firm and our firm have both worked with companies around the lifetime value of a customer. How much does it take to attract a customer, keep a customer, educate a customer, and how much are you willing to put into that? So I think there's going to be a lot more around identifying customers and at least trying to identify what they want and what they need.
Other questions?
I think that's starting to happen. If you look at Procter & Gamble, which is the example that's held out there the most, if you look at Procter & Gamble and how much money they're starting to pull out of the traditional ad market and move into other markets now, they're concerned. It's like the advertisers, it's the product companies themselves are concerned that the money they're spending, which has been traditionally going into what we call legacy broadcasting or legacy media, is being wasted. And that's why they're starting to pull back. So not only have they pulled back generally and redistributed some, they've generally pulled back just to wait and see what's going to develop. So that's been a problem.
A positive note on all of this is that, as we've described earlier, as the content is more effectively targeted to the consumer, the advertisers need to follow that and not, for example, a single campaign, not focus obsessively on that 30-second spot, but come out with an array of messages targeting down to those consumers. And as the content gets targeted more effectively than the ads do, the beauty of that is the value of that ad spot goes up, and it means we all watch less ads because you support that content and that program with a fewer number of impressions, which ultimately I think is a very positive thing, not only for the content industry, but for the consumers as well. And the advertisers have to go there. And I think to your point of Google, it's a perfect parallel there that you can deliver a much more effective advertising campaign with fewer impressions and a lesser impact on the consumer if you're more intelligent about how that consumer is and the context in which you're delivering the ad. So ultimately, one of the challenges for the industry is this dynamic ad insertion. If the industry can't dynamically insert an ad based on when I'm watching it, how I'm watching it, and where I'm watching it, they're not going to be able to leverage a lot of this ability to really drive down the number of ads that consumers view.
And that's key, and that's key to just understanding your customer and where they are and how much privacy you're willing to give up about who you are and where you are. I mean, those are all the issues.
Tell President Bush that. We have time for one last question. Go ahead.
one form of content business model not spoken about is gambling. Just wondering what your opinion is about how that might evolve in the U.S.
Well, we know what happened recently, right? You're talking about betting, gambling, Las Vegas, Atlantic City style. Of course, it's prohibited in the U.S. online at this point. And there were. Oh. Yeah, they can. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's very compelling. It's not going to happen anytime in the U.S. right now, I don't think. With Congress obsessing about MySpace and talking, I was on Capitol Hill the other day, and they're still obsessing about protections of MySpace and in other places, maybe rightly so. But I mean, I think gambling is just would push them over the edge in the U.S. at this point.
Isn't that the main mantra for the Democratic
but it's very
campaign?
compelling. Yeah, it's a very compelling revenue model.
Well, I think if you could do it state by state, you would have it. I mean, that's the biggest problem in the U.S. is there's federal prohibitions where state by state, and I think there's Indian gaming in almost every state in the country now. So if you could establish it on a state by state basis, but again, all this technology blurs state lines and makes it seemingly impossible to do. So if somebody could come up with a technology that would limit television-based or even online-based gaming to a state that was really airtight, I think they can make a lot of money.
It's a hell of a revenue model.
Okay, thank you.